Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Texas Policy Summit. My name's Andrew Brown. I am the Vice President of Policy with TPPF. We're glad that y'all are with us today for a discussion about what I think is one of the most critical issues facing our state and the nation. You know, it's no secret that our nation is facing challenging times, and it often seems we're in the midst of a struggle for the very heart and soul of America. Now, the left likes to warn that our democracy, quote unquote, is constantly under attack and at the very precipice of being lost forever. Now, at the risk of alienating all of you and having you walk out before the panel gets started, I will confess that I tend to agree, but not for the reasons that the left cites. Democracy isn't under threat. The American public isn't under threat from whatever politician you decide is the next tyrant in waiting. It's under threat because the foundational institution of civil society, marriage and family, is eroding. And it was the great Ronald Reagan who famously observed, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. Fewer Americans are choosing to marry, to raise children, and once vibrant communities are struggling. The weakening of marriage and the family, in my opinion, is the root of many of the problems facing American society today. John Adams wrote that the foundations of national morality must be laid in private families. In vain are schools, academies, and universities instituted if loose principles and licentious habits are impressed upon children in their earliest years. Our panel today will explore both the causes of family breakdown as well as solutions for revitalizing these most critical institutions. And I am honored to be joined by 3 people who are at the forefront. They are literally on the front lines of revitalizing and rebuilding American marriage and families. Senator Lois Kolkhorst, to my left, serves as the Texas State Senator for District 18. She was elected to the Senate after 7 successful terms in the Texas House and now serves as the chair of the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services, where she oversees policies impacting families as well as the healthcare system. Senator Kolkhorst has led the state through the COVID-19 pandemic and created new initiatives aimed at improving our foster care system, women's health, maternal mortality rates, and the welfare of Texans. A small business owner from Brenham, she's a 6th-generation Texan, is married to her high school sweetheart, and is a dedicated mother to 2 children. Next to her, Carl Caton is the president of the Marriage Initiative and managing director of National Marriage Week USA. He leads efforts to help community marriage initiatives begin in cities and states around the country. Carl's passionate about the family and is a sought-after expert in the areas of parenting, fatherhood, and marriage. He's a 5th-generation Texan, is also married to his high school sweetheart, father of 2 kids, and grandfather to 4 grandchildren. And then on the screen, Brad Wilcox is the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. He's a professor of sociology and serves as the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Brad is one of the nation's leading researchers on marriage and the family, and his new book, Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, was released last month. I highly recommend picking that book up if you haven't done so already. He earned his bachelor's degree in government from the University of Virginia and a master's and doctorate in sociology from Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming our amazing panel. So Brad, I want to start with you because your new book just came out, and what prompted you to write this book, and what in your view is the current status of the American family?
Thanks, Andrew. I want to give the audience here really 2 pieces of news. There's good news about marriage in America, and then there's some bad news to think about as well. The good news actually is that for our kids, we're seeing a slight uptick across the country in the share of kids who are being raised in stably married homes. And that's because divorce has come down since 1980, and the share of kids who are being born outside of marriage has stabilized since 2009. So that's the good news, Andrew. But the bad news is that the marriage rate for adults has continued to decline fairly precipitously from 1970 to about the present. And that means that lots of Americans, lots of young adults in particular, are not going to get married as we kind of go forward. In fact, we're projecting about 1 in 3 young adults today will never get married. And so this book really is aimed more at adults, trying to give them both kind of a rationale for thinking more seriously about getting married, and then also kind of to give them, a sense of how they can forge a strong and stable marriage. Because there are plenty of voices today, both actually on the left and now on the right, people like Andrew Tate, for instance, who are discouraging our young adults from getting married and telling them that they're going to end up divorced and the like. So my book aims to kind of give young adults, again, a rationale and a roadmap for forging a strong and stable marriage in the 21st century.
As a follow-up, what do you see as the root causes of the breakdown of the family that we've seen in recent years?
So I would say part of the challenge is that too many of our government policies end up penalizing or otherwise undercutting marriage. I'm thinking, for instance, of marriage penalties that today fall pretty heavily on working class families with kids and things like Medicaid, for instance. I'm thinking too of the way in which there are too many voices in the culture, particularly elites, who are de-emphasizing or devaluing the value of marriage and stable families for men, for women, for children, and not kind of using their authority in like public schools, for instance, or in universities or in the media to kind of tell us the truth about the value of marriage and family. And then the third thing that I would mention is the way in which too many of our boys and men are floundering in today's culture. They're not doing well in school. They're not doing well often in the workplace. They're not doing well in life more generally. And that, of course, affects their appeal and their attractiveness as boyfriends and potential spouses as well. So those three things, there's a lot going on, but those three things are worth, I think, keeping in mind right now in terms of understanding why marriage is in retreat for adults across both the US and also in Texas as well.
This is odd. Can you follow up on those three? Name them succinctly. One?
Government. Two is the culture kind of devaluing marriage. And the third is sort of the floundering fortunes of men and boys in America.
Absolutely. Carl, pro-family policy, often viewed as a right of center issue. You're in the communities. You're working with folks. You don't do politics day to day like many of us. What's your view of that? Is this truly a partisan issue, or do you see bridges that can be built between folks of different ideologies?
We're seeing a lot of bridges, and I'm going to use 3 words together that you don't hear really often, and that is brilliant federal policies. Because in the 90s, we did welfare reform. You remember that? That was moving people from welfare to work, and a lot of that was underwritten by Robert Rector at Heritage Foundation. So it was brilliant federal policy that was advanced, actually signed by Bill Clinton. But when George W. Bush was president, he saw some things that needed to be improved, and that's where this policy got really brilliant. And that was that under Bush administration, they realized, especially with TANF funds, that we were giving so much money to families, but when they were at their worst possible moment. And in the Bush administration, they brought in Dr. Wade Horn, who's now a Deloitte consultant, brilliant, super neat guy. And he said, let's take 2% of TANF and move it to the upstream of the breakdown of the family. Why are we waiting until families are at their worst, most expensive moment to engage? Wouldn't it be smart to move some of this money to the upstream and promote healthy family formation? So under Bush, it was a marriage thing. And then under the Obama administration, it became a fatherhood thing. But here's the thing. We're talking about the same thing. Here's what we're talking about. Father presence in homes, right? Why do we need father presence in homes? Because kids need a mother and a father in their house, and they do better by every measure when you have father presence in homes. So essentially, we're talking about the same thing, whether we're fussing about it being marriage or we're saying it should be more fatherhood. It's really the same thing. Let's create two parent intact families. And I think if people went away from the legislature and didn't talk about politics, but just talked about their family and got pictures out and looked at pictures of your family and shared with each other what your hopes and dreams were for your family, I would say no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you would be perfectly aligned in that moment. And that's what we need to do as a state. We need to come together for the benefit of our families.
Senator Kolkhorst, you've made promoting marriage and families a centerpiece of the work that you do at the Texas State Senate, and I think passed one of the most consequential bills that we've seen in a long time for families last session with SB 24. Why is this an issue for you that you think is such a priority for policymakers to be involved with?
Well, I'm smiling because what Carl said is, you should share your pictures of your family and share your hopes and dreams for your children. And many times I'm made fun of because I talk about Lois, Kate, and Jake so much. And for all you young people out there, I want you to know that I look back as a lawmaker, and Lois Kate was 11 months old the day I announced to run for the legislature. And she was 2 years old the day I was sworn in that said, "So help me God." And Jake was an interim baby. And we went back and looked, and I think I'm only the third woman in the history of Texas to have a baby while serving. Now, there have been there have been many more since. So breaking some of those glass ceilings. So I love what you say about, talk about your family, share your dreams for your children. You want your children to live a better life than what you did, and you want them to be greater. So one of the things that I have to say is, during session, and I've always been pro-life, but post Dobbs, it was time to look at, well, what does it look like? We've spent so much time trying to be successful on the abortion issue, to be able to say that the life of the baby begins at inception. But what does the world look like? And as conservatives, do we just care about, the baby was given birth, but we don't care about the baby after they're born? Of course we do. And so that was my inspiration for SB 24. And I think that, pro-life, the next step in this is pro-family. And so SB 24 was a step in the right direction. I will say that it needs to be perfected over time, but what we took was like the PEI, that's prevention and early intervention programs, that were dociled in the Department of Family and Protective Services, which is kind of the police over taking your child out of the home, and we moved it over to HHSC in an important move, taking the monies for alternatives to abortion and converting those now into a post-Dobbs era. And I think over time, this is really going to be a monumental piece of legislation. One of the things that I also did was I removed evidence-based, that moniker, that stamp of approval, because I know that a lot of great work is being done at the local level in our communities. And that's by nonprofits that don't necessarily have all this research and everything that they have to do. And I wanted to get the money to the people, to the families, do those wraparound services so that we can, what does that family unit look like? Get in there before they're at their worst point of a crisis. So that's really what I was looking at. And I'm going to say, because I don't know if the next question is going to be there anyway, the family unit it's something that has stood the test of time. It has stood the test. It's older than all these governments. It's older than all these countries and dynasties. It is the most important unit that we have to promote self-governance. It is the family unit sets it is what sets your priority and your success, and all the statistics and great professors like y'all can show the numbers. And so I'm really glad that we're having this panel. I call it kind of a soft panel in a way, and so I smile about it. My eyes were gleaming when you said, get out your pictures of your kids. Let me do that for you, Jake pitched a great game on Tuesday night, 4 perfect innings. Love it in relief, right? Let me tell you more. Lois Kate's doing great, whatever. That's wonderful, and I love that part of it. But guys, this is a role that we can all play, and I see a lot of young people out here. And the institution of marriage should not be looked at as balls and chains. It should be looked at as something that we celebrate. It's a wonderful step in your life when you're ready to make that step.
As we talk about family policy, and you will inevitably get to the point in the conversation where there's this debate on, one, how much can government actually do, but are the trends that we're seeing more of a product of culture? Are they a product of economics? Are they a product of something else? And so for each one of you, I want to go down the line starting with Brad. I want to ask that question. Is what's going on with the family, is it more a product of culture, economics, or something else?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I would say it's especially a product of culture, but it's important, I think, in this day and age to understand and appreciate how much culture is shaped by public policy. And I know you guys in Texas are thinking about schooling, for instance, in some important ways coming forward. But economics is also a big factor. I talked about the changing kind of fortunes of men in our culture today, and shifts in the economy have been a big part of, why a lot of our younger men are floundering today. So we have to think about, both strengthening the culture when it comes to marriage and family, but also adjusting to new economic realities that have made, many working class and poor Americans, especially young men, have greater difficulty in finding their place in the world, and then also their place vis-a-vis dating and marriage as well.
Carl, culture, economics, something else?
I'm going to say something else. Social problems persist when what we think about the problem is wrong. You believe that? Social problems persist when what we think about the problem is wrong. And what we don't realize is this incredible connection between family and society. And I love what you said earlier, because I'm so in line with that. And let me make a statement here. The strength of a nation is built on the character of its people. And the character of its people is formed and forged in the homes of our families. Now, why would I say a crazy thing like that? It's because one of the things that our founding fathers knew, in fact, it's all they talked about, and we have forgotten, is that you can only govern men if they are governable. In fact, our founding fathers, in an analysis of our 4 primary founding fathers, they said the word virtue more than they said the word freedom. Isn't that kind of interesting? Because what they realized was that freedom only exists among a virtuous people. Where do virtues come from? We were going to lead in National Marriage Week this year with virtue. And we have a national New York City PR firm, and they said, don't use virtue because the American public doesn't understand exactly what it is. Isn't that interesting? And so, this is interesting about virtues. Let's get into social science. Virtues are passed along what's called lines of affection. That's an interesting statement. Why is it? It's because as a young person, the people that love you, that care for you, that invest in your life, those are the people you look up to. And those are the people you capture the great virtues from. My dad was a district judge. He was a World War II guy. He was courageous and he was honest. And I watched him be courageous and honest throughout his life. And I captured that virtue from him. And so let's go back to the founding fathers, because they said some crazy things. Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Or how about what John Adams said? He said a crazy thing. He said, the Constitution was created for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. So why do I say the strength of a nation is built upon the character of its people? It's because until we have strong families, until our families become stronger, we're less likely to have more virtuous next generations, right? It's all connected. And that's how we send a virtuous generation on before us, is you raise them up in the strength of a family.
Very well said. Senator Kolker, is culture, economics, something else?
I think you could end the panel right now.
Well, thanks, everybody. Well,
No, I really, take that clip, and you young people get that, and you just pass that along to your friends. Because what Carl just said, in a nutshell, is that it's both and other. And I'll just say it like this. I think that the tendency for government, any government, is to grow in power. You know, we see it with our local elected officials. We see it on a state level. We certainly see it on the federal level. And the goal of, if you look at Marxism or other things, is to replace God with government and to replace family with government. And so if you can break down the family, you're really on your way to controlling the people. And so, you know, I think that there are government policies through the years that, of course, those that have studied it have incentivized and decentivized the family formation. Or, you know, you look at welfare. Back in the day, we paid women more to keep having babies in a single family. That was a bad policy, right? But I also want to say culturally, nature versus nurture, which goes to the virtues. We're all a little different, created by our Creator differently. But I was talking to a young person the other day whose sibling is by nature different, but she was watching her brother in a relationship with a young female, and she said, but his nurture is the same. We're by nature different, but our nurture is the same because of our parents and how they loved us, and that our parents had come from families, two-parent families, where they were also nurtured. And so I think that this is very important for the family unit. And we have a secular society that, I mean, how many people still go to church on Sundays? It's real easy to skip that, whether that's to go to brunch with your friends or be at a select baseball game or whatever it is. And so, you know, if you look at that evolution of us migrating away from God or the supreme being, something bigger than ourselves, you start to lose those virtues. You lose that family unit. And as we lose our family units here in this nation will fail. It will fail. So that's why I think this panel and then your panel on wokeness yesterday are probably your two most important panels.
Brad, I want to dig in a little bit on the policy side of things. How do economic incentives like the child tax credit and other things that you've written about help families that are citing financial struggles as one of the reasons why they're delaying formation?
Well, we are seeing across much of the country, probably in some of your more metropolitan areas in Texas, people struggling to keep up with, obviously, not just the cost of living, but also the cost of housing. So insofar as people are also oftentimes kind of working less when they have young kids in the household, you know, both the federal government and a number of states have been thinking about the child tax credit as one way to help, particularly working and middle-class families, kind of juggle the burdens of caring for the next generation. So I would encourage Texas to think about, you know, adding a child tax credit. Could be like $1,000 for married parents, you know, per young child, and $500 for single parents per young child, to both kind of make the costs of rearing the next generation more manageable, but also to kind of acknowledge the importance of marriage too in Texas. But I think thinking about the cost of living in a number of ways and kind of tackling a number of different fronts would also be helpful. I know that your foundation is going to be doing that in the next year. So one other big issue, obviously, is housing, and thinking about ways to increase the supply of affordable housing, especially single-family housing, because that's really especially, I think, important for families with kids to have access to, you know, reasonably priced housing. And then one idea my colleague Patrick Brown at the Ethics and Public Policy Center has articulated would be allowing parents of young kids in Texas to take a 20% reduction on their state property tax as a way of kind of tackling in part, you know, this issue of housing costs for young families. So these are some of the ideas that might be helpful in, you know, making family formation and the rearing of young kids in Texas more affordable.
Senator Kolkhorst, you talked about disincentives. You know, I think we all know that policy can be a double-edged sword. Would love to hear your thoughts on ways, especially in Texas, you feel like we have disincentivized families through some of the policies and things that exist in code right now.
Yeah, I want to build on something that he said about housing. It's something I'm really interested in right now. there's a phenomenon going on across our state, nation, where houses are being bought up by institutions, and they're artificially inflating the price of housing. When interest rates go up, it also hurts the young family that wants to buy a home, the young person that wants to buy a home and settle down. And we had a couple of bills last session. I'm not sure why one of them got vetoed, but we'll come back. Senator Hughes and I will come back with that bill. But the World Economic Forum and their leader, Klaus Schwab, says, you will own nothing and be happy. That includes that you're not going to own your own home. You're just going to be a renter. So I think that there's some policies that are disincentivizing the next step forward for our young people. And I talked about this at a panel in Navasota, Texas, and an African-American lady came up to me afterwards, and she was young. And she said, look, I really want to follow up with you on this. She said, I can't afford to buy a house. She said, the smallest house is just out of my reach. And all my life, that's all I've dreamed of. That's what my parents did. And if you really look at it, again, it's the next step in creating that family unit, that you own something. You're building equity. You're building something that you can potentially pass on or build wealth with, which, again, money is a part of raising a family. Money, you have to have money like that. So that's something I'm going to focus on. I think we've disincentivized that the housing costs are too high, and there are things that are going on that are artificially inflating that. I like your tax credit idea. It's a good one.
Thank you.
Carl, engaging culture is a big piece of what we're doing. It's a both and is kind of the solution that we came to with that earlier question. Talk about the work of the San Antonio Marriage Initiatives and how you mobilize communities to support married couples and families.
Well, thank you. So I was involved in family policy in the 90s and trying to come to the state and advance some things, and I got pretty disappointed by that. We just were moving pretty slow. So for the last 20 years, I've been working more in how can we mobilize communities more effectively. And this is the key I want you to remember, is that large-scale social change requires broad cross-sector collaboration, not the isolated intervention of individual organizations. And what we mean by that is we have thousands of nonprofits in our communities, but they're pretty much very isolated, they're underfunded, they're under-resourced, and they're not well connected to others. And so we've developed a process called Local Frameworks. It's a proprietary process. It's about how do you advance communities coming together around really difficult, complex social issues in our communities. And so in any community initiative, no matter what you're working on, whether you're working on foster, marriage, fatherhood, whatever you're working on in a community initiative, there's essentially three things you need to do. You need to inspire, to resource, and to empower. And I'll just quickly unpack each, okay? Inspire is to elevate the importance and value of your family strengthening effort. It's like, let's understand what marriage really is. Let's elevate marriage in our communities, or elevate fatherhood, or elevate the importance of fostering. So it's there's a great organization in Boston called FSG. And FSG does a lot of research on social change. And they said the most important work you do in social change is changing the mental model of how people think about the problem. It's a reframe. It's a shifting of the mental model. The most important thing that you do, that's what we do in Inspire. Then the resource is how do we help all these resources flow more effectively into our community? We believe around the country that there's 2,000 organizations that collectively produce 5,000 resources for family, over 1,000 resources just for marriage, 5,000 resources for families. How do we help those best-in-class resources flow deep into the heart of our community? San Antonio has become the most marriage resource city in the country. We offered our city 210 events last year to grow in your marriage. We become the most marriage resource city in the country because we engage those national resources, help them flow into our communities. So we say inspire and resource, but ultimately and most importantly, we've got to empower people, not just in the helping professions, but all of across our community. How can we look into 7 or 8, 9 or 10 sectors of our community and empower people broadly across the community so that each one can be working in their highest and best role to contribute to solving this problem. So we always think about the local church. We need to empower the local church. You need to empower people in the helping professions. We empower divorce attorneys. We asked our divorce attorneys in our community, we said, would you change your protocol to ask couples filing for divorce, is there any glimmer of hope in your marriage? And they said, we never thought about that. We're empowering divorce attorneys to help couples find better outcomes. What if you're a pediatrician? What's your highest and best role to play? You're at an amazing moment in a young couple's life when they're having their first child, and you can speak into this couple's life and to say, your family life is going to change. Your marriage is going to change. Prioritize your marriage even after you have kids. See, there's a highest and best role to play. So empowering people, we've mobilized an army of people across San Antonio, and we have community initiatives like what Jerry and Kate Angelo are raising up in Missouri, and so we're talking with teams in 30 cities around the country. How do we mobilize people very broadly around these three elements?
Can I ask him a question, follow-up
Absolutely,
question?
yeah.
So when you talk about pediatricians, you're right, pediatricians, OBGYNs and stuff. And have y'all looked into what our med schools are teaching?
No.
So kind of one of my thought processes, and there are complaints that our med schools have gone too woke or whatever that means, and I don't know how to define that, and it's nebulous to me. But there could be something that we look at that there could be some learning opportunities for our physicians, nurse practitioners, and nurses, because again, they have an incredible moment to help in that way do some of this work. So that's an idea. Look, we should get together more often.
Let's do this. We'll have you back anytime you want to be. Carl, real quick follow-up for you. You said San Antonio is the most resourced city now with marriage and family supports. How have you seen that move the needle? Do you have data on kind of the before and after?
We believe the divorce rate has fallen by 24% in our community since our founding 15 years ago, and that's
Incredible. That's 1 in 4.
that's not a big number because we still have 9,000 couples filing for divorce every year. So we've got a lot of work to do in our community. There's 400,000 marriages in San Antonio. 80,000 of those marriages are in the struggling category. 9,000 couples will file for divorce. The taxpayer cost of divorce in Texas is $38,000 per family, which means we have a $300 million a year problem in San Antonio that nobody's talking about. Isn't that interesting? You see how we need to have a reframe on these things? It's like, we need to have a conversation. We're spending $300 million. 2/3 of the taxpayer cost is juvenile incarceration. Why is it? It's because boys from these families are more likely to enter in risky behavior.
Brad, you've been a big proponent of using public service announcements to impact culture. And that's something that I admit when you brought it up when we had lunch the other day, I was like, really? Public service announcements actually work? Unpack that for us. How effective are they, and what do you see in areas where these have been running in promoting marriage and family formation?
So what we know really about PSAs is derived from kind of experience we've had with smoking campaigns and also with campaigns around bringing down teen pregnancy. And there have been a variety of different approaches to just simple kind of ads to kind of more sophisticated efforts to kind of put messages into pop cultural television shows. But there's been some pretty sophisticated evaluations of those efforts that tell us, Andrew, that when they're kind of done right, they can really help to rethink the shaping, the hearts and minds, and the behavior of adults in general and young adults and adolescents in particular. So I think it's kind of worth having Texas think about, the potential role of PSAs and kind of messaging campaigns, targeting especially social media platforms that would be, giving a more positive message about what's called the success sequence, which is the idea that if you get at least a high school degree, work full-time in your 20s, and get married before having kids, you're much more likely to be flourishing financially and otherwise as a young adult. But then kind of also just more generally conveying a positive message about marriage and parenthood, because the broader culture, both in terms of social media, pop culture, and then also a lot of media outlets are often kind of giving a pretty negative depiction of marriage and parenthood that doesn't correspond to the reality, which is that for most Americans, being both a spouse and being a parent is linked to more meaning, less loneliness, and markedly higher levels of happiness.
You mentioned the success sequence in your comments there, and I don't want to breeze past that because this is an incredibly important and powerful concept that you've extensively researched. Will you walk our audience through the success sequence and how you've seen it applied across the nation to impact families?
So the success sequence is, again, kind of just taking 3 steps for young adults. And one is about education, especially getting at least a high school degree. The second one is about having some experience of full-time work. And then the third part is getting married before having kids, putting marriage before the baby carriage. And what we see is that young adults who follow that sequence are much more likely to avoid poverty as at their late 20s and 30s. Only 3% of them are poor if they do at least those 3 steps. And it kind of makes sense because education, work, and marriage are really the 3 pillars of the American dream. So we'd like to kind of get that message out to kids in public and private schools across Texas. And we've seen some new legislation passed in Utah. They're going to be doing more work in Utah on that front. There are already a number of different relationship education programs across the country that are incorporating the success sequence in rural, suburban, and urban contexts. And so we're hoping that other states besides Utah will also considering adding some kind of success sequence into a financial literacy, requirement, or some kind of family life education or relationship education requirement, in their state standards. And so I hope that would be the case for Texas as well.
And I really want to spike what Brad just broke down. And for those of you who are parents of young kids, I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at home, and this is something that I'm going to be repeating with them over and over throughout their lives. But if you follow those 3 steps in that exact order, finish your education, get a full-time job, get married before you have kids, 97% chance you will never be in poverty in your entire life. This is, there are no silver bullets, but this is about as close to a silver bullet as I think I've seen in policy before. I want to dig into this idea of education with you, Senator Kolkhorst. When I was engaged, my wife and I benefited from premarital counseling and financial literacy training. There's actually a provision of Texas law right now that encourages couples to engage in premarital counseling, and it allows for the waiver of a required 72-hour marriage license waiting period. Do you believe the legislature can do more to incentivize couples to engage in premarital counseling and getting financial literacy training before they get married?
I do. And one of the things we were discussing as staff, not making it a requirement, but incentivizing it. And so I'm open to those kinds of ideas, because if you look at that success sequence, which I didn't quite have the stats on that, all of us here in this room probably think, well, that's, those are just kind of like check, foundational values and things like that. But when you can say to a young man or a woman, this is what you need to do. I've always been huge on financial literacy. I think we should be teaching it in our schools. We see the credit card abuse. We passed a bill years ago that, we had credit card companies all over our college campuses, just handing out credit cards and getting these young people in debt because they really didn't understand, oh, wait, I got to pay that off, right? And then the interest rates are out of control when you can't pay them off on every month. So I think we need to focus on those things. The 72-hour waive, that's nice, but that's really not enough. So, could it be some kind of tax credit? Could it be something that we could build off of in some other financial way? Is something that we're really kicking around, because I think it's a great idea. The other thing is the role of churches. I don't know how many of you, but when I got married and we were getting married, Jimmy and I were getting married, we had to go through, marriage counseling with our pastor. And I do think that our churches are doing less of that And you see so many venues where you are not getting married in a church, and there are beautiful venues out there. I have a lot in my home district of Senate District 18. A lot of people come to the country to get married, and that's wonderful. But they're not attached to a church, so they're not getting that counseling. So what role can we play with nonprofits and other maybe non-traditional ways to get marriage counseling? There's, it's a big jump. Sometimes you benefited from it. You
Very
said
much so.
You learn a lot. Men are from Mars and women from Venus.
You
kind
get
of
those
thing.
differences of opinion out of the way early.
We are wonderfully created differently, and I celebrate that. I do celebrate that, but you need to understand that when you go into that marriage, right?
Yep. And it's always helpful. We had a wonderful mentor couple in our church who walked with us even through the first year of marriage. And when you hit those first big conflicts, like having a couple that knows you, that you trust, that are invested in your relationship, we'd go over and sit down over dinner and be like, here's what we're dealing with. We hit this wall. Help us figure out why.
Super point, which nonprofits and again, some of our religious organizations can really do in mentoring. That is, if you don't have parents that you can fall back on, and even when you're a parent, you're kind of defending your child versus the other, someone that's a little more neutral that can say, hey, there's wrong, both of you are wrong here, and so let's figure out how we can move forward. Important. So great ideas with that, and I'll be available afterwards if y'all have some good ideas of how we incentivize, again, financial literacy, marriage counseling, things that will give you a chance for success.
And that's a great segue to the next question, because we've been throwing out ideas and solutions. For each one of our panelists, I want to go down the line again. What do you think are some of the most important things that state policymakers can do to promote marriage, reduce divorce, and support families? And things that we may have not mentioned, or something that was discussed that you want to circle back to and really emphasize the importance of that solution. And Brad, we'll start with you on this.
So we did a poll with Patrick Brown, Institute for Family Studies and Ethics and Public Policy Center, and we looked at a bunch of states, including Texas, and we found was that more than 3/4 of Texas adults were supportive of the success sequence. They were supportive of establishing a commission to look at the plight of boys and men in Texas, and also were supportive of school choice. I think those are all things that could be helpful for strengthening families in Texas. I know that school choice is now on the verge of probably passing, and that'd be great for giving Texas families more choices. But also, people don't realize there's research indicating that kids who go to private schools are more likely to forge strong and stable families after graduating. So just one more reason, why Texas should move forward on the school choice front. But then also we found that about 78% of Texas adults were in favor of some kind of ban of smartphones, at least in classes in public schools. And then we think the legislature should be addressing the potential value of having age verification when it comes to allowing kids to access social media. So the idea here, we're kind of following in some other states' footsteps, is to encourage Texas to think about basically not letting kids access social media platforms unless their parents have given them permission to do so. And you could do that with the contemporary age verification technology. And that's kind of important for families, because smartphones and especially social media platforms are often pretty harmful for our teenagers, and sort of one factor kind of that can be a source of tension between parents and their teenaged children.
And our Better Technology for Tomorrow, Better Tech for Tomorrow campaign is working on those very issues regarding social media and minors. So if you're interested in learning more about that, talk to David Dunmoyer or the Honorable Zach Whiting, who are leading that effort. Senator Kolkhorst, other policies that you think are important for promoting marriage, family formation?
I'm going to just state something that I think we had a big victory on a bill that Attorney General Paxton defended on age verification for pornography websites. Guys, that's a really big deal, and I think that like not just social media, but what's before our young men, it's really harming our society, the virtues that you spoke of. And so something that I think we have to focus on, again, when we discussed, I don't want to focus on men here, but That was one of the things of why our men are delaying marriage. You know, Victor Davis Hanson's one of my favorite people, and I think he's just so brilliant about what he talks about. And I was able to hear him speak once about a year ago in my Senate district, and he talked about the goal of what it used to be was that, you know, you either graduated from high school and you were able to go and you get a job or a trade, and then you settle down and you buy your house and you get married, and you know it's just a wonderful thing. Or you go to college, and then after college hopefully you meet your wife somewhere along that line, and you get married and buy your house. And so what we're going to be looking at is policies that, you know, promote those kind of things. And again, you know, I don't think that government, I don't know, you have to be very careful about the role that government plays. You know, you really do. But there are ways that we're doing things that disincentivize. We have to get rid of those, and we have to build on what we're doing. TPPF is a great organization. We'll be carrying some of those bills.
Carl.
So family policy is a really interesting form of policy making. It's very different than other forms of policy making, and because there's some unique nuances, because it's so personal to us, right? So there's three forms of policy making in the family space. There's to protect, to promote, and to renew. To protect, all these protective policies, these are short-term defensive type policies that we create, like SCOPE. That was a really great protective policy we passed. Because we're protecting our families from the onslaught of culture and society. The area of promote tends to be more strategic, more long-term, more proactive. How do we promote healthy family formation in Texas? And then renew is like, how do we take stuff that's on the books and that's been defunded and revive it again? We used to have the best legislation in statute on marriage preparation in the country, and when we removed all the funding from it, so it's kind of a zero now. But let me give you an honest, can I be honest for a minute? So in the area of protect, we're leading the country. I think we're doing great work to protect our families. In the area of promote, we're about 5, 10, or 20 years behind. The states that are doing forward-thinking, very strategic policy making are Utah, Minnesota, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Florida. Florida is advancing a $70 million fatherhood initiative that's getting ahead of this. So we're not always, you know, on the tail end using taxpayer money when families are at their worst possible moment. So I think here's the bad news first, and then the good news. The bad news is we're way behind on the proactive form of policy. The good news is we don't have to figure this out. We just have to follow all the model legislation that's working in other states where we need to catch up. And I'll just say, in defense of our legislature, we've been dealing with a lot, right? Who else is dealing with the border the way we're dealing with the border? And who else is dealing with all the issues we're dealing? I think our legislators are doing an amazing job, given all the challenges that Texas uniquely has. But as we kind of catch up with things, we need to switch from a defensive short-term strategy to a more long-term strategic strategy. Like Governor Stitt of Oklahoma, he is wrapping his entire economic program around healthy families, making Oklahoma the best state in the country to raise a family and drawing people to Oklahoma to move to Oklahoma. This is a great state to raise a family. We should be thinking like that, and we should be moving like that.
This has been a great conversation. I wish we had more time to really dig into this some more. We're grateful for each of you for the work that you do, for being on our panel with us today. We want to switch to Q&A time, but before we do that, please join me in thanking our incredible panelists. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We've got a microphone that'll be coming around. Reminder of the TPPF custom. A question is a short statement that ends with an upward inflection in your voice and that little squiggly punctuation at the end. Right there in the back.
So the demographics in this room kind of remind me of a dance class where there's actually maybe even more ladies than men in this room, which is encouraging that women are interested in starting a family also. So I better be careful about what I say. The quickest way is I think institutions have replaced the family. So we're at a policy conference talking about how government can become more involved in the family. And we're conservatives. What makes us conservatives is that we believe in those traditional, timeless values that have worked for humanity for thousands of years. And in the old days, the way people got married is they wrote their names on a Bible, and the state was not very involved in the marriage. I'm in San Antonio, so we have 13, 14 district judges, and they're all liberal ladies. They're all Democrats. And is the father still, so to ask a question, is the father still the head of the household? Because what discourages me from getting married is that's not who I'm going to give authority over my household to, liberal Democrat ladies in Bexar County. So is the father still the household? Is the father still the head of the household?
Yeah, I'm a Christian. I profess that, and absolutely, the father is the head of the household. And I'm a pretty strong woman. I mean, Jimmy, he's got to have a lot of confidence to be married to me, right? But Jimmy and I have open conversations sometimes. When we hit tough times, I look at him and I go, "You're the head of this household. We need you to lead." And sometimes it's in parental decisions. It's pretty tough. I'm at a different stage than you. Been there, done that. I always say little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems,
Exactly,
right?
yes.
But yes, absolutely. And that's biblical. So I stand by that. But as a strong female, I am not like I have my voice and we parent together, but the man has to be the head of the household.
And I'll just tack onto that. Your job as the head of the household is to lay down your life. Lay down your life for your wife and your kids. That's what we're called to do. I would switch any day. Your job is to lay down your life. My friend Lance Winterow, sitting right next to you, I think you used to say this, Lance. You said any guy would take a bullet for his family. The challenge is living every day for your family. It's the everyday that's the more challenging.
Down here in the front.
Thank you so much for this important panel. Yeah. Thank you so much for this important panel. I'm a mother of 4, so honored to have my children, and this is a really important conversation to have. This is something that is not unique to Texas right now or the nation. I think we can look to harbingers in Japan, in Europe, the PSAs in Denmark to have more children are not working. And to Dr. Wilcox, your third point, what are some cultural things that we can do, maybe not relying on the government, to build 3 of my children? I have 3 sons, and what can we do to promote young men, boys, to become leaders in society? Because I do think this is a serious issue.
So I think that in terms of building up the fortunes of young men, of adolescents in our culture, there are a couple of different ideas that we can think about. One is to kind of articulate a new model of masculinity for the 21st century. I think part of our challenge today is that we as a society have kind of ceased to kind of give teenage boys and young men more generally a kind of a clear and compelling vision of what it means to be a man. And so there are, in that kind of vacuum, voices like Andrew Tate's that kind of step in and kind of give, a more destructive or antisocial view of masculinity. I think we also need to be reforming our schools so that they're much more boy-friendly. What we see in schools today is that oftentimes it's the girls who are really doing well on average and the boys who are floundering on average. And we could think about pedagogy, we could think about single-sex schools, we could think about trying to get more men into the classroom as a way to kind of bridge that gender gap and allow our boys to flourish more in school, which will then, of course, position them well for flourishing later in life. And the third thing that I would talk about is just sort of the importance of figuring out ways to address the sort of the gaming challenge, the way in which so many teenage boys are spending many, many hours on video games and in ways that kind of really undercut their capacity to flourish in school, to be out, active in the out of doors, and to develop, talents and skills, including social ones that would make them, I think, increase their sense of self-worth and their appeal to, to romantic partners and down the road to spouses as well.
I'm so glad you brought up gaming. Thank you. And the masculinity issue as well.
And can I just tack on? Brad Wilcox, my colleague here, this is the smartest guy in this country. He is a young guy. He is one of the most solid men that I've ever met. Brad, you have 8 kids, is that right?
No, we've got 9 actually.
9 kids. And but if you'll follow, he's a senior fellow at Institute for Family Studies. If you want to see the best in class thinking on family every single week, look up Institute for Family Studies. And Brad is the leading thinker of that. And this man, he's going to be with us in San Antonio in May. We're so excited to have him with us in person. But he is the best in class thinking in the country, and he is so admired by his peers. As a very young man, 20 years ago, he wrote the book Why Marriage Matters, and then the book Get Married is kind of like the updated research on everything related to marriage and family. I can't say enough about Brad. I'm just so sorry you couldn't be with us today, Brad, because or at least in person. I'd love to give you a hug.
Okay, thanks, Carl.
I think we got right down here in the front.
I like to start with an ask, and then off that ask, making the question. And that is, look at the family from policy from a biblical point of view, not a capitalist point of view. So the tax incentives and everything else, I think that defunds and devalues the father of the house. So the ask is, look at all these non-custodial, whether it's the father or the mother, child support, all these other programs that are out there that are actually working against the institution of marriage. So if we're going to put a policy in place, capitalist-wise, for example, what about the thought of capping what lawyers can make, what the state can have as a time limit or timeline in the whole child support process and so forth? And I would love to give details from a personal point of view, but my lawyer and I had a good discussion on Tuesday about that. But really, the capitalist point of view, I would ask you guys to look at the institutions that are in there that are supposedly being protective. Thank you.
Carl, you and I have talked a little bit about the way that the court system is structured and around divorce and the roles of attorneys. Do you want to unpack that question a little bit?
Yeah, so I said 3 forms of family policy to protect, to promote, and to renew. And one of the things we need to do in the renew space is we need to, on our judicial committees, work during interim hearings. And I'd love for our Lieutenant Governor to prioritize some of this during interim hearings, because family policy doesn't get prioritized in interim. But for instance, there's a lot of dead letter law that's in statute that we just need to renew. We need to get this working again. We had one of the best statutes in the country on encouraging marriage preparation. And then it got defunded in 2009 during the Great Recession. And so our in statute Together in Texas program is essentially not working. So there's a lot of stuff we can do in interim. And getting back to your question, the family courts are overwhelmed. The family courts are overwhelmed. They're not updated on the research. That's the newest research on like where couples are that are filing for divorce. The research says that of couples filing for divorce, 45% still have one person leaning into the marriage, and in 10% of cases, both of the couples are leaning into the marriage. This is lost on our judicial system. They're like, what are you talking about? They're not aware of the research. They're not aware of the resources. One of the best policies in the country, and you were asking me about Minnesota because it's called
Minnesota?
Well, the University of Minnesota is a brilliant think tank, and Dr. Bill Doherty, who Brad would brag on, is a great thinker, and a great policy they had was called Minnesota Couples on the Brink. So what they did is they raised the price of the marriage license just a little bit to create a pool of money So it's revenue neutral. Everybody loves that, right? And then they sent that money to universities to research what can we do to help divorcing couples find better outcomes. They created an entire new genre of counseling called discernment counseling, which essentially all of our family court judges are completely unaware of. And that's where we got to catch up as a state. So we need to emphasize that during interim in judiciary committees. We need our Office of the Courts to begin emphasizing this with family court judges. You need to get updated on the research because you'll be surprised. And you need to be aware of the resources that are available to us because you might be surprised because of couples filing for divorce. If you go through a marriage intensive, you're 70% to 90% likely to reconcile. Wow, interesting, isn't it? We need to be updated on that in our courts.
I think we have in the back.
First of all, thank you all so much for your time. I just have a quick question in regards to like millennials. It's not like it's for a lack of trying, but I see a lot of young ladies in this room. I live in rural East Texas, similar to this room, way more women than men. And I actually went through premarital counseling with my ex-fiance, and that's one of the reasons that I saw that we were unequally yoked. One thing that I've seen as well is that this rise of boyfriends wanting girlfriends to be in submission when the Lord has only called a wife and a husband to be in submission to another. So how do we market that to young men so that they're not trying, like to, for lack of better words, to peg a woman down while they're in the dating phase? For me, similar to you, I would like to think that I'm a powerful woman. So I run into this weird dilemma where at first men are attracted to me because I'm powerful, I have things going for me, but then they almost try to like peg me down a couple steps once they fall in love because they're trying to show me how it is, but they're not even my fiance, they're not even my husband. And so I keep running into this problem. So I keep having to date older. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I would like to build a life with someone that's my age so that we can have similar attitudes, similar things. But I see this happening with not just me, but a lot of young ladies that are my age, I'm 29, that are having to date significantly older because men our age are just not stepping up to the plate. And even some of our conservative men, not necessarily ones in this room, but other ones, you know, like with the rise of Bumble, I hate Bumble. I think it's like an app for beta men that want women to make the first step. And it just really drives me nuts. So I know that's a lot, but what advice would you give us? I hear y'all talk about young people a lot, capturing the teenagers, capturing this. Well, what about the millennials? Or we're all gonna end up single, like you said, 1 and 3 with no children. So I don't know what to do. I just wanted to ask.
Were you in the car with me and my staff driving up today? Because this was the conversation we had. These guys have all the research. I'm just going to tell you as again, kind of a strident female, I would say, former, athlete and everything else. You have to date a man with a lot of confidence. The reason they want to peg you down is because they don't have the confidence to be with you. So this is part of what we need to do is raise confident men that rejoice in strong women. I talk about that nature and nurture. Strong women, man, we love big. In my family, I'm called the mama bear. Now I can get after my children, my cubs, pretty good. It was hard. I'm hard on my children. I expect excellence from them, but I also, I love them fiercely and would lay down my life for them as well. So confident men that rejoice in women that want to flourish and have children and be successful in their careers, because you can do both.
Brad, part of her question was specifically about millennials. What are you seeing in terms of millennial marriage rates and attitudes right now in the research?
There's a slight softening in their kind of interest in marriage, and certainly kind of, marriage rates are low for young adults today, more generally. And as I said, we're projecting kind of some pretty marked declines going forward for both millennials and for Gen Zers as well. So, I just think that the kind of perspective we just heard articulated in the room is very much found on the sort of right and the center and the left. When I talk to young women today, there's just a pervasive concern about their ability to find a guy who's worthy of commitment, not to mention marriage. I think this is one more reason why we have to think about, ways to sort of make our culture promote a more positive view of masculinity and do a better job on the educational front of, lifting the fortunes of our boys so they, grow up into 20-something and 30-something guys who are appealing and attractive as adult males. And then two, think about ways to revisit the role of technology. We've been talking a lot about social media in the lives of young women, adolescent females, 20-something women. There's a big challenge there that we all know about. Jonathan Heitzman writing about this, Jean Twenge as well. What we need to also now turn our attention to the role that video games have been playing, and I think undercutting the capacity of young men and teenage boys to flourish, which then affects their appeal later in life as potential boyfriends and husbands.
Right here in the corner.
Okay, so disclaimer, married, happily married, all that. I've got two younger brothers who aren't married, and I think there's a statistic that's widely well known. I think it's 50% of marriages end in divorce, more or less. Is that right? So sometimes, and I want to get your opinion on what would you say to a young guy who has this opinion, who says, well, you know, I want to get married, but like I said, 50% of marriages end in divorce, and when that happens, you know, the woman gets the house, the kids, somebody else ends up raising your children, and oh, by the way, I got to pay alimony and child support on top of that. So if a young man's coming to you and saying, you know, this is why I don't want to get married, what would you say to them?
So let me just jump in quickly here and say, number one, I think what's important to recognize is that divorce rates come down since 1980. So that idea of 1 in 2 marriages ending in divorce was true in the 70s and early 80s, but it's no longer the case. So we are projecting now is that probably around 40%, give or take, of those who are marrying today will get divorced. And that's not great, but it's not, you know, 1 in 2 marriages ending divorce. And there are a couple of things you can do to reduce the risk of divorce as you know, as a man or as a couple. One of those things, which Carl I think would certainly affirm, is just having regular date nights to kind of keep the romantic spark alive in your marriage. A second thing that we see in the research is that stable male employment is pretty important in reducing the risk of divorce as well. So I think just encouraging guys to be more intentional about being reliable workers, you know, in their marriage and their family. And then the third thing is, and this was sort of touched on by Senator Kolkhorst, is the role of faith. And what we see is that couples who attend church regularly or some other religious community regularly are between 30 and 50% less likely to get divorced than their peers who are not, you know, plugging into some kind of local religious community. So the point that I'm making is that there are ways out there today that you can kind of minimize your risk of divorce. And it's important to kind of just talk about them and give young adults and young men in particular who are often discouraged about marriage and worried about divorce, you know, some concrete evidence that they can use to forge a path towards a strong and stable marriage if they go ahead and put a ring on it.
I'd like to speak into that. Remember I said we need to shift our mental models. We need to reframe. And we don't need to go back to the marriages of the 1960s. It wasn't working that great. Ask my dad, who was a district judge. And we need to remind ourselves what marriage is. Marriage is a challenging adventure with a breathtaking summit. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Marriage is challenging, right? You got two people like trying to figure out how to live together. It's a challenge. But interesting, young people these days are not afraid of challenges. Young people are doing incredible things, you know, climbing all these incredible mountains and doing all these amazing things. So we shouldn't be afraid of a challenge. But marriage is also an adventure, and it's a really exciting adventure to be on. But more than anything, Tim Keller says that outside of our relationship with God, marriage is the most profound relationship there is. It's the most interesting relationship this side of heaven. It's the most interesting commitment we make to another person. And so for young people that are not sure if they want to be married, first of all, the divorce rate is not 50%. It's around 30-something. If you do a few things well, like Brad was talking about, he advanced some research on dating. If you if you connect daily, date weekly, get away regularly, the likelihood of you falling in divorce is like 2%. Okay, that's what we need to reframe and help younger people know. No, and a lot of this comes back to some of your comments earlier. Millennials see, this is what the research says, millennials see marriage as fragile and unreliable. But that's not true. Because if you invest in your marriage, if you commit to your marriage, if you work on your marriage consistently, then your chances of divorce are virtually zero. And that's what I would encourage you to share with your brothers.
Yeah.
One of my questions is, okay, so my understanding is that women seek to be loved and men seek to be respected. And those are kind of the core needs of both sexes. So how can we make sure we're, I guess, loving women no matter how they manifest themselves? And then, like, how can we make sure we're loving men no matter, like, what their background is or their strengths or their weaknesses?
Brad, you want to take that one? That's a good one.
I don't really have a clear response to that question. I mean, I would defer to you, Carl, on that one.
This has become a marriage counseling
yeah.
seminar.
And my staff is gleefully saying, don't answer anything here.
Yeah. Well, Emerson Eggerichs wrote the book Love and Respect. There's a lot of truth to that. Gary Chapman's 5 Love Languages. Yeah. There's unique ways that men are made, unique ways that women are made. We need to celebrate the differences and enjoy the differences. Wow. I've been married 41 years. It's a beautiful thing.
Say in my own marriage, it's the communication, and it's just being open about what you value and what each spouse needs, understanding how they want to be loved, and then being proactive about doing those things, right? And I am by no means great at it. I have to work at it every day. But my wife is also very good at giving me, that positive affirmation that men want, because we're basically puppies. But she'll communicate, like, hey, when you did that, that was valuable to me. You communicated with me in a way that made me feel seen or made me feel supported. And so just that openness, that communication, you talk about marriage being work. You brought up Tim Keller earlier, and I think it was Keller who said this. It's one of my favorite quotes, is marriage was designed to make you holy, not happy. Now, happiness is a byproduct of the holiness. But I think for our culture especially, that's a very countercultural idea, because the generic, secular American culture is, well, your personal happiness is the most important thing in the world, and it's not. Happiness is a great thing. It's a gift of God. It's grace. But marriage is meant to make us into something more. And so communicating that and holding on to that truth, I think, is really a key to answering your question. I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
Can I add one thing to
go
that?
for it.
Listen. We're all so busy, but listening, and if men seek to be respected, part of that is slowing down our busy lives, especially when you have children, because you're busy, movement, and you stop to have couch time with your husband, to sit down and say, how was your day? What are you working on? And to value that, to value that in that, I'm a state senator. Am I doing something more important than Jimmy Colcourse today? No, I am not. And so I sit down and I listen to him. 37 years later, it's worked out okay.
Pretty good record. Well, I'm getting the signal that it is time. I really appreciate the engagement. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to your question. Before I let you go, though, I want to take a little bit of moderator's privilege, because I just noticed that I've got a good friend and hero actually in the room today. So I was privileged last session to work on Senate Bill 14, which those of you who follow things know it was the bill that banned gender modification procedures from being performed on children in the state of Texas, and we're going to win at the state Supreme Court here pretty soon. But Soren Aldako, please stand up. Soren was there every day sharing her story with legislators, testifying. One of the most courageous people I've met in my entire life. I'm so happy you're here. Thank you for everything that you've done. And thank you all very much for being with us today. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.